Okay, so upgrading, and as you can see from the picture that I chose for the slide, this is a scary thing, right? Upgrading is scary? That's way too few people actually raising a hand. I don't believe you. Okay, so who's already using PHP 8.2? Okay, that's about half, I would say. What about 8.1? Okay, that's more. Who's using something older than that? Why? Okay, how old? 8.0, okay. That's okay-ish, I guess. Anybody on 7 something? Okay, bye. No, really, seriously, if you ask the PHP project, anything before 8 doesn't even exist anymore. Anybody using 5? Just, wow. In active production? Okay. Wow, and you said it's not scary to upgrade. Why didn't you upgrade? Because it's so easy? No budget, okay, but if it's so easy, you don't have to actually do anything, right? Okay, anyway, so hi, I'm Arne Blankerts. I'm part of a consulting company that happily sponsors this conference a little bit as well. Sebastian's sitting up front here, so if you have any consulting related questions for PHP, maybe upgrading, come find us and we might be able to help you. Other than that, upgrading, of course, is, well, not necessarily always easy, but there are various approaches what you could do. And commonly what developers do, at least based on what we hear from teams that work with us, is like, yeah, we looked at the code and we figured it should not be a problem. And that's like looking into this magic crystal ball kind of thing. Yeah, it'll work, no worries. Well, you could do that. You could also just upgrade and then vanish into a nice vacation and then have somebody else deal with the aftermath. Well, very relaxing for you, maybe not so relaxing for your colleagues. Not an option? Okay, well, maybe not. So how do we find out for real if stuff would be working and if upgrading is as easy as it should be, or as some of you potentially claim it would be? Well, first of all, we need to have a recent PHP version, and recent today means PHP 8.2, at least if you talk about released supported versions of PHP. Well, that should be easy. And depending on your operating system, and in most cases it's a Linux-based distribution one way or another, there are various means of doing this. So if you're in a Red Hat, CentOS kind of, or Rocky Linux, or whatever these variations these days are called, you can use a repository by Remy, which is one of the guys working for Red Hat, and maintaining pretty much everything PHP related there. And he has an easy means of installing PHP 8.2 as an additional something. So with this prefix, it's pretty much all the packages that you would potentially be able to install. Just prefix PHP 8.2 in front of it, and then you have it as an additional environment. So that means you're not going to mess with anything that you actually use in production, because it's just an additional thing, unless you already use it as a production thing, of course. So that should make it easy to just test if things are working. If you're not so much a Red Hat fan, but more like Ubuntu, Debian kind of things, you can do the same kind of thing with Andre's packages and just configure which one you want to use in case you want to replace the default ones. Or if you're like into the container world, of course you can just use a container and just run this in a different container. So that was easy, right? That's the easy part, I guess. So now we have a recent version of our environment. But the best thing to figure out if stuff is working is by running the tests we have, right? So it makes a lot of sense to just use PHP unit that you probably use all the time anyway, and, well, just run the tests. So now we have to figure out what version of PHP unit to actually use. And while I would love for everybody to use PHP Unit 10, particularly since we made quite some effort of changing a lot of internals there. It might not be the version you should be using right now. So if you're upgrading from a comparatively old version of PHP, let's say PHP 7.3, then probably PHP Unit 9 is something you should be using, because our idea, at least for now, is to support that particular version, and Sebastian can tell you more about that in his presentation tomorrow, as long as we can without actually making breaking changes. So that means that if you have used PHP Unit 9 for tests in PHP 7.3, you can run those tests on PHP 8.2. It will not understand anything that PHP 8.2 introduced in terms of syntax, but you're trying to upgrade a project that has been running on 7.3, so you're not going to be using any actual new syntax features here. So that should be easy and a good choice. Well, let's install that. And one way of installing it would be using 5, which is an installation environment, just to making all the handling of getting the file distribution easy and checking signatures and all these things that you want if you download stuff from the internet. So in this case, I'm having it already downloaded. I'm just going to link that. In this case, it's PHP Unit 9.6.8, which, at least when I made the slides, was the most recent version. Okay, if he doesn't know, then I'm fine, I guess. And I'm just going to run the tests. In this case, I'm using a small templating engine that I created called Templado. And apparently on PHP 8.2.6, everything is fine. So I have 100% code coverage. So that means I'm good. Everything is fine. Yes, upgrading worked. Well, that was easy. Bye. Okay, not so easy. Okay, so what happens if it's not such a perfect world example? And I'm not saying that Templado is the best engine ever created, but I spent considerable time to actually creating all kinds of tests to make sure that it's actually every functionality that I intend to be in there is actually working as intended. And given that I use PHP Unit 9, I can run this on all the versions that Templado is supposed to be working on. So if you're running a project that is, for whatever reason, required to run on PHP 5 and PHP 8, that might not be an option. Maybe it's time to drop these ancient releases, but that's of course something you might have to decide by yourself. And maybe you don't have all these tests. Who's having 100% code coverage on everything they created? Yeah, okay. Who does, right? I mean, okay, so obviously we need some help here. And just to give you an idea of what people are actually using and where people or things are coming from, this is a graph that's been tweeted like some time ago about what PHP versions are being in use in Germany in the semi-official like bureaucracy kind of areas. And I'm not sure how they actually still manage to keep this running, but there's PHP 4.3 listed. It's a miracle that it's even working. But maybe it's a system that nobody touched, and if it's going to fall over, it's not going to boot anymore. I don't know. So the amount of people using modern versions apparently isn't that good. And I mean, if you looked around when I asked in the beginning, you saw quite some hands being raised for old versions of PHP as well. So I guess that's kind of representative graph here. So to get out of this messy situation, rewriting everything obviously is not an option. Manually upgrading things by looking at individual lines of code and deciding whether or not they should be working is also not an option. So we need tool support. And yeah, we just have to figure out what kind of tools might be helping us. And if you have no idea what kind of tools you might be looking for, maybe it's like, okay, let's Google. And one of the things that Google spits out is PHP Code Sniffer and PHP Compatibility as projects. Which sounds pretty cool, because that's exactly what I need, right? I have a code base, and I want to figure out if I would be consider to run this on a different version, could that even theoretically work? This, of course, is not necessarily telling me if it's working as intended, but if it's syntactically possible to run this. Okay, so let's have a look at PHP compatibility. And I'm not trying to bitch at that project. I think they did an awesome job. But as you might see from this slide, and I'm just going to present it on here, this is the date of release of that particular version. I'm going to do this here on this side as well. It's 2019. Yeah. They handle things from PHP 7.4 being introduced here, which is included in that particular release. Last time I checked is 2023. That's 4 years. And I guess we had a few PHP releases since then. So maybe this is not really up to date. And if you look into the tickets and when they've been created, account for changes introduced in PHP 8.1. And that's 47 tasks. And none of them are completed. Okay, so if I want to upgrade to PHP 8.1, not even thinking of 8.2 here, maybe that's not really helping, but PHP 8.0 is certainly being covered. Okay, so 19 out of 41 tasks. That's also not really helping, I guess. But if you're at the really old version of PHP, maybe to getting to 7 something might still help you. So if you're really stuck in like 5.6 or 7.1, 7.2, or maybe even 7.0 in between, maybe that's going to be helpful. Other than that, I think this project, as cool as it would have been if that would have supported what we want to do, I don't think it's currently apt to do that. And as you might have noticed on the screenshots, there's always like the same person dealing with the ticket or creating those tickets. And I'm not mentioning this to bash on her, because that is a really nice person, but she's doing so many things in the open source world, it's literally impossible to keep up with all the projects that she's supporting. And if nobody else is taking over to deal with these issues, then of course the project is not necessarily thriving to get new releases out anytime soon. To be fair, I think this number changed to 21 tasks being completed like a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so maybe this is not helping us. But funny enough, pretty much everybody these days seems to be using PHP Storm as an IDE. Well, some people are using like this visual something from a different vendor, but quite many still, or probably continue to use PHP Storm. And it's really funny to me because back in the days when the version 1.0 of PHP Storm was released, we were at a conference where that company was showcasing this, and everybody was like, why would you need another editor? And then like literally like 2 or 3 years later, that's what the only IDE everybody was using. So they did something right. And since version 1 of 2022, that's the exact build that I used to creating the next slides, they have support for PHP 8 and later versions. So with every new release, of course, they add new functionality and also support for newer PHP versions. And that's relevant because you have a nice means of enabling the appropriate inspections and have the IDE tell you like, hey, what you're doing here is deprecated or is not working or has been removed or is not working in that particular version of PHP that you decided for this project to be using. So if you have a somewhat recent version of PHP Storm, if you enable the appropriate inspections and tell the IDE, hey, I want to change the version of PHP that I'm using for this to that particular version and run the inspections, it will generate such a nice report for you telling you exactly where things need to get changed. It even has some quick fixes for some of them. So if you just say like, well, repair this because it's just flipping things or renaming things or replacing a certain thing, that can be done using the IDE. But that's manual work, right? So how do we do this in a somewhat automated fashion? Well, we could use the CLI tool. And Many people apparently don't know this, but it's perfectly legitimate if you have a license to do this even in CI. We asked them if this is like, how's this license-wise? Well, if you have a license, you can use this as well on a CI environment, and you could run this on a command line. So while this looks pretty complicated, it's actually pretty simple. It's the shell script that is just a wrapper to starting the Java application, or Kotlin by now, I guess. Tell them that you want to do the inspect and give a bunch of parameters, which is where you actually are, what your working directory, where the configuration is that you want to use, which is like the settings, what PHP version, and what kind of reports to generate, as in what inspections to actually run. That you want to have an output in JSON format in the version 2 of that, and you want to have it process the directory, which is relative to my current working directory src folder, and all the error messages that you would get that the Java stuff would spit out, I'm just going to ignore. So while it looks complex, it's actually pretty simple. And if you do this, you get a lot of text when it's running things, and it's going to analyze all kinds of things. And I created a small test project here that has, by the very idea of this, to report this, all kinds of deprecated things or stuff that simply don't work. And at some point, it's going to be done. And then you have a JSON file that contains some IDE-specific variables, like the project directory being like relative to the current directory, so it's not specific where you have it. But if you have that project as a project on a different platform, you can still resolve those directories. And you can see, like, okay, we are doing this here, and like, hey, you cannot modify globals anymore, which is one of the changes that PHP 8 had. So with this, it's now something you could use for automated handling. You can create tickets from that. You can write code that will change that. If you have the static analysis to PHP parser has a means of changing code, so you could create, if it's specific what you want to do, a small speeds of like run once script that would just look at this, see, okay, this is that particular change on that file, so I'm going to parse this file, make that modification, and write it back in a changed fashion. Pretty much what all the code sniffer and CS fixer and things do as well. Or you decide to not do this manually because it's a standard thing to do and use Rector. And Rector being one of the sponsors, and I don't know if he's here. Thomas? Okay. Being the tool to refactor the things for you in a semi-automated fashion. And you can get it by simply installing it with Composer or get it the FAR, depending on what you feel like. And it comes with a lot of things to actually change code for you. So given that you have version control, it's probably pretty, safe to just run it and see what it does. One of the things is really like, there's a lot of rules that you can allow to be executed and just see, okay, this is reformatting this, replacing this construct with a different one. And this is a bit more than just changing one keyword by another. It can actually change a lot of logic as well. It's like, hey, I use this construct for this, and I'm going to replace it with a completely different one. Depending on the rule, there can be a lot of things that are going to be changed. And you can see, I hope that's somewhat readable on the slides. Like you can have an automated refactoring happening if you have a read-only class being created. If all the properties that you specify in a constructor are marked as read-only, it can automatically refactor that to use the read-only as a class. So potentially a simple thing, but also like detecting that there's UTF-8 encode and decode function calls that you might have used in the past. If you did, that always was a bad idea because it makes really weird assumptions on what the original encoding is, because by definition it is treated as if it would be ISO encoding. If it's not, it doesn't care. It just does what it's doing to get it to UTF-8, which will potentially be horribly broken. With the MB string functions to convert it, that's one of the options that you could use. It will now do this in a more sane fashion without the weird assumptions. This is just two of the examples what this thing can do. And yeah, I guess I don't have to say anything about PHP because we saw what it is, and many people raised their hands earlier, so that's a tool that pretty much everybody knows. So I'm just going to skip over that to save some time. But there's of course a competitor, which is called Psalm, which does pretty much the same thing, giving you feedback on what is happening with your code and what you might want to change. And the reason why I'm advertising those tools is not necessarily to make everybody write better software, which of course is always a good idea, but particularly if you want to upgrade things, having a code base that's not annoying you with random messages of like, here's something deprecated, this is broken, there's a notice of doing something weird, hey, how about these types don't fit, and all kinds of warnings and deprecation notices or whatever. Yeah, just behavior of PHP that is not necessarily desirable will pollute your log files. So if you have something that has, I don't know, we just had that in the discussion earlier, that there was somebody running tests with PHP unit that has so many deprecation warnings in there that it ate memory like crazy just to handle all those. If you would log all that stuff, how would you actually find the actual errors that you have to fix for actually stuff that needs to get addressed? And it's pretty much the same thing if you are trying to get help with HTML, CSS kind of things. The first thing is like, okay, if you talk to anybody in any forum, okay, does it validate? No? Okay, fix that first, then come back if the problem still exists. That's the same thing here. So if you have any issues with PHP upgrades, make sure that these tools don't have anything left to complain that is actual errors that would have to get addressed. There might be kinds of things that you realize are like, okay, this is correct technically, but practically not a problem, then you can ignore it, as Andre said in the beginning. But for most things, it's like, okay, maybe I should address this. And it's really scary, even for people that are standing on stage speaking about it. It happens often enough that we run tools like this, even on potentially old code base, and we're like, okay, now as I get this tool complain about this particular fraction of code, looking at it like, okay, how did this ever work? And it's not going to get better by upgrading to later PHP versions. So please do yourself a favor, fix those things. Okay, so let's assume we're having this really old code base. We ran all the things we could do. We have Psalm and PHP Stand and all the other tools happy. We have a nice formatted code. All the tests that we found are actually working. Are we safe to run this in production right away? Well, I guess the picture gives it a bit away. So probably not. Because what we did is we changed code. Maybe we fixed some issues on the way. We ran tests which probably are not causing 100% coverage. Not speaking of line coverage, but also not having 100% branch coverage to begin with. So we don't really know what the software is doing. So simply deploying it might work, but we're not necessarily sure it's working exactly the same way as before. And that might be a problem, because all the tooling that we could use is telling us, okay, this is syntactically broken and it doesn't work, or this is technically not working in that version of PHP anymore, so you have to come up with a different construct, which should be identical in its behavior, but I guess the should gives it away. This is not necessarily guaranteed. So still, we don't know if it's working exactly the same way. So this is where characterization tests come into play. Who here wrote characterization tests before? Yeah, that was to be expected. Okay, so that's not that many. Okay, who here knows what a characterization test is? Okay, yeah, if you wrote it, that makes sense. Okay, so the idea of a characterization test is not to ensure something is working correctly, but to ensure it's working exactly the same way as before. So if you have like a simple calculation function, for example, that adds 1 plus 1, and the answer is 5, which is obviously wrong, but if you were have a characterization test, you would ensure that it's still returning 5 even after changing in runtime. So if you upgrade it to a later version of PHP and it now returns 3, which is still wrong, but it's definitely wrong, then you have a problem. Not because you can't do math, because you didn't, or you were not supposed to change the behavior of the software while upgrading. So the most important lesson here in that small subsection is that if you're trying to migrate from one version of PHP to a different version of PHP, don't fix behavioral issues that you find on the way. At least not directly, because you're not actually helping yourself. If you have a piece of software that's running in a certain version of PHP, pretty much record what it's doing. There are different means of doing this. One way would be just to call the whatever method, maybe make a wget in worst case to a certain page and save the result. And then upgrade to a new version of PHP, knowing that all the other changes that you had made to actually make it run are going to be applied. Then run this same wget call again and compare the results. And if the results are identical, you know that the behavior of those two different environments is identical. It does not say at all whether that behavior is correct in terms of what you wanted from a business perspective. It just ensures that the software behavior did not change by upgrading to a different version of PHP. And that is going to rescue many projects, because if you don't have the nice small unit tests and all the test pyramid things that everybody keeps talking about, this is the last resort. Making sure that whatever you can trigger by doing API calls, whatnot, that the behavior that you can observe is identical. Because that means nothing fundamentally changed in what you just did to the software in terms of its behavior. That, of course, can have potential side effects. If you have software that deals with time, that might be a problem. Might, because that depends on your architecture if you have to have that problem. The best solution would be to have a software with testing written in mind, so it's easy to have the system under test not look at the actual clock, but something that you provide as the clock, which as a default implementation will ask the system clock for the current time, but in a testing environment can return any point in time that you feel like. So if you claim, like, hey, it's now 3 a.m. in the morning, well, then the system has to believe that, because it's not actually looking at the clock. It's just using an abstraction to that. If you don't have that, let's say you have like new datetime now somewhere within your code, well, now you have to get a level deeper. And there are actual libraries that allow you to override the C-level functions that are being called to do this. There are also options to, with LD preload on a Linux environment, to actually have that on an external thing, so the application doesn't even know it's going to be messed with. So there are always ways to trick time. The best way would be to redesign your software, but that might cause quite some side effects, so maybe that's not the best way to do if the software didn't have that option to begin with. But it's always a solvable problem. That also has a problem with databases. Because if you create random values and store that into a database, or you get index information back, then you have to have a database that is reset to certain things. So if you have the database create the timestamp based on inserting, then of course the database needs to have a fixed time. So it might not just be PHP that is relevant for messing with time. And of course, if you're doing things randomly, like, okay, I need to pick something from somewhere randomly, this is of course not a very predictable thing, because the very idea of it being random is that the next time you call it, it's not going to be the same. So again, for random, there are, well, depending on what you want to test, I guess, different ways to deal with that. So the simplest thing would be to say, okay, I'm just going to fix the random seed, because there's no such thing as actual random in computers. It's always based on something that just is perceived as random because you cannot necessarily predict it. And if you want to have it cryptographically safe, then this is of course the most important factor, that you cannot predict the next value that you would be getting. And they do a lot of effort to actually ensure this kind of thing. But at some point, the initializing part, there's something that is called the seed, which starts this random kind of thing. And if you know that particular seed, this random is not random anymore at all, because the sequence of things that you're going to get is identical every time. So if you say this is the seed value for my random function, and I call it 10 times, I'm going to get exactly the same 10 numbers every time again, as random as they may seem the first time you got them. So if you're lucky enough, you might get away with that by simply setting this random seed and storing it. PHP unit would be potentially doing this for you if you wanted to. I already mentioned sequence IDs. Databases are the standard example. Many implementations, for whatever reason, choose to use databases to store information and use in MySQL or in Postgres sequence numbers to have an automatically incremented value to make this a unique identifier, which tightly couples your application to the fact that it's written in a database, because otherwise you don't have this auto-incrementing ID for that particular object. If you were not to do that, but actually create the object yourself and have your own way of dealing with IDs, and just use the database to persist the stuff, that would be a lot better from an implementation perspective, and would put you in control of having those sequence IDs. But if you can't do this, well, then you have to reset a database and also reset the increment factors to whatever kind of preset value that you want to see. With MySQL, you can simply change the table and say, okay, the next auto increment value should be this, and then it will continue from there. So even if it has been created before and you want to just start over, you can fake that into an initial state that only contains the stuff you want. Okay, the meanest part in all this, particularly since people are like into this microservice external things, everybody has to talk HTTP to everybody. Well, except in your Amazon video, I guess, is talking to external services, right? So how do we do this? And it may surprise you, but given that we have a fixed environment, so we want to do exactly the same kind of request again, chances are we're going to have the same kind of response back. So the easiest thing that you could possibly do is have a proxy in between and simply save the response based on the query you sent. So it's a simple key value match, right? So you have whatever kind of query coming in that's being sent to that external service. Instead of forwarding it in the testing environment, you're just going to replay the response you just got in the earlier run. Because we're not testing the behavior of the external service, we are testing the behavior of our application. So it's supposed to send exactly one type of request. We can make sure that this is actually the request that we expect. That's part of the characterization. We don't care whether or not that request is correct. We want to ensure it's the same, right? And we want to have the response back that we got from that external service when we originally sent it, and just pretend that we did this operation. And again, this can be written in PHP because it's comparatively simply to implement. So in general, it comes down to testing. Who would have thought, right? And I think it's a bit pretty much like you would do at home in case you have to do dishwashing at home. You can pile up all the stuff of the whole week and then are annoyed that you have to do so much dishwashing, or you can do it on a daily basis. And then it's maybe just one plate that you have to clean. And this is the same thing that many projects do, or should be doing, at least. And just some random examples from, like this case, the PHP compatibility project, testing things on all kinds of PHP versions and just verifying it's working. That does not necessarily mean you actually have to fail a build on a version that you don't really care about right now, but it would give you an identifier to say like, hey, we run these tests on that particular version and we saw issues here. This is not affecting us because we are not officially supporting that particular version of PHP, maybe yet. Maybe it's not even officially released yet. If you have an RC build or even a nightly build from master, it's really helpful to do these kind of things. And even for PHP unit, we did this on all kinds of platforms, because it's not just PHP itself, it's also different platforms that we care about. And this is a comparatively old screenshot, so Sebastian, don't be annoyed. Just because it's like a really huge matrix, and we changed that to look differently now. But still, the point is like, okay, we're running this on different distributions, different platforms, macOS, Windows, Linux, and on different PHP versions, different combinations of things, just to ensure that the behavior of the software is the way we want it. Of course, we don't necessarily have to test anything that is PHP internal or PHP unit internal that is independent of all the platforms, but there's a lot of stuff that's specific to Windows or specific to Linux to make it actually work. So speaking of doing things every day, I just figured the best example would be doing it on my own code. So I figured, okay, I want to ensure that my software is working on even PHP versions that aren't actually released yet. So I'm creating a job that is, in this case, using a PHP nightly build, which is updated every night on the current status of master of PHP. So this is likely to change every day because people are working on PHP itself. Chances are it's going to be breaking because PHP is broken. So it's not something that's going to fail my pipeline, because I don't know if this is a bug in my software in the case a test breaks, but it could be any of many reasons, right? Could be PHP broken, could be I couldn't download this particular build because that build didn't work. I don't know. So this is just an informative aspect. It's a small detail that helps me to understand how my software would be doing on something. If with a version of PHP would be released today, would my software be working with it? So doing this on the stuff that worked, I mean, it's the same PHP unit version, it's the same version of my software. And what just happened? Apparently, my software, in this case the Templado templating engine, seems to have serious issues on 2 tests when running with a not released PHP 8.3 version. How annoying. But given its 200 something tests, 2 not working on a software version that's not been released yet, how hard can it possibly be to fix that? And looking at the error messages, they are pretty much the same. So it's actually one issue that I have to fix. And I don't have to do it now. I can do it next week or in a month, because chances are that version of PHP is not going to be released anytime soon. But I'm knowing upfront, quite a lot upfront, that my software is likely to have issues. Well, when trying to figure out what this issue might actually be, I honestly had to admit I had to Google this, because I had no idea what that error message was supposed to tell me. And turns out it's based on enhancements that have been done to the XML support in PHP, the DOM document stuff that this engine is using heavily. And something I do in the test, not even in the actual implementation of the software, is not necessarily according to the XML standards, which I wasn't aware of, because I was always fond of myself like, hey, I know XML, I'm really good at it, and I did something basic wrong. And this triggers this completely not helping error message. But once I changed that, well, I was frustrated, but once I changed that, it's a really minor change. I had to change the way I create a test namespace. I used A:B because I figured that's a valid namespace, because the definition I heard before was like, well, the only thing this kind of specifier has to have is a colon in there somewhere. Apparently that's no longer true, or never was correct, I don't know. It has to be either a URL type of format, so HTTP, HTTPS something, or it has to be an identifier that is known as in registered, or it has to have URN up front. Okay, so let's add URN to it, run the tests again, hooray! So that took about 10 minutes of Googling and trying to understand the problem and finding the correct answer out of all the things that didn't help at all, as Googling goes, and then making those 2 changes. Like, okay, could that really be that simple? Changing to the IDE, writing URN before, run tests again. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
Amazingly on time. Thank you so much. Thank you. Go on, clap, Enege. Come on, keep clapping.
Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions? Anyone? I've got some, but have you got any? No, okay, me. So, how often is upgrading really a problem? Because I think oftentimes when we think, oh, we need to upgrade language, it's like, oh no. So, is it really, I mean, from experience, depends from what version you're upgrading, I suppose.
It's probably not very fair for me to answer that, because given that we are consultants, usually people come to us when they have a problem. It's like being a doctor and like asking everybody who's coming to me is sick, right? I mean, apparently that's your job. So every time we see a project, from a consulting perspective, that's because people are having issues with it. And of course, upgrading is one of the issues that people come to us, mostly because they don't have enough tests or they don't really know of the side effects of all the other things that need to change along with that. Quite common, it's like, okay, we have this old unmaintained system and we don't really know what it's doing in all the glory because the people who set up the system are no longer with the company, as it goes, I guess. So yeah, it's a common problem. It should be easily avoidable by the things I hopefully managed to make clear today, but I guess that's not the reality yet for most teams. And so yeah, quite often it's a problem.
Which is why we've got you and people like you to fix the problems for us. And, oh, is PHP moving too fast?
I guess also that depends on whom you ask. To me, I think the pace that it finally got is actually quite nice. The fact that older versions of PHP are still available for like a relatively long time, all the projects out there seem to support comparatively old versions relatively long. And I don't see necessarily that as a problem. I mean, many people say, okay, upgrading is a problem, but that's mostly because they make it a project. If you would keep the runtime up to date, keep those daily builds like that just showed, then I don't think that's a major problem, because you're just moving along. All the dependencies of the tools that you're using want to make use of the new language features, want to, well, benefit from performance increasements, all kinds of things. That should not necessarily be a major problem. If you break down your software into smaller modules, not necessarily saying microservices here, then of course it's a small item that you can easily upgrade. Maybe there's some component that you can't, but then the rest is upgraded. So you can make smaller changes. Things are not like, oh, gigantic refurbishing kind of thing. Yeah, that's annoying. That's a lot of work and nobody knows what the outcome would be. Particularly since developers have a tendency to say, and I'm not excluding myself here, changing this? No, let's do this completely anew. And then
shiny object.
Yeah, and then of course breaking it and not getting it delivered because 80% of the features that were being used, nobody had on their radar.
Thank you very much. Once again,
there's a question.
Sorry, no, I have a question from the audience online.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm trying to read it properly. Have you ever had success upgrading a complex project from one major version of PHP to another major version of PHP with Rector? Let's say 7.4 to 8.2.
I myself did not need to do that yet, but I guess Thomas is here. I'm not sure if he's here right now, but you would be the better person to answer. He's selling that as a service, so I think that's quite likely to actually work. We had run individual rules. I tested that on smaller things like refactoring certain things, upgrading it from like one framework version to a different one, or swapping out things like that. That certainly works without any issues.
Thank you. Another one. If a framework like Zen Framework 1 is used with a large code base, how can it deal with a PHP upgrade?
Yeah. I don't think that's an generically answerable. What you can of course do is just make sure that it just works in the current versions of PHP, which is just by changing like what needs to get changed in the individual calls. If that is the way you would write software today, I would probably disagree, but that's not the point of upgrading, right? I mean, that's exactly the idea. I'm going to make the same piece of software work on modern hardware, modern environment, recent versions of everything around that. But particularly if it's then Framework 1, I think it's relatively safe to say you inherited the code base. So whatever is part of the framework that used to save you time is now yours, and it's part of yours to maintain. So if there are any security problems, anything that needs to get touched, it's your responsibility now, because there's literally nothing you can do, because nobody's going to support that, as far as I know at least, out there of that particular version. What you could of course do is try to migrate things away from that, but that's a relatively large project to actually do that. Can be done, we did that with clients, but that's individual work, and that would be actually, well, I don't want to do marketing sales kind of things here, but that would be exactly what consultants would be helping with.
Thank you. I think we've got another question.
Yeah, and there's also one in the back, really long, but you're the moderator.
Great talk.
Thanks.
You've been talking about the application side of upgrading PHP versions. What do you recommend, or what do you see out in the wild when it comes to the version that's on a server? So imagine you have your great application, it's valid for PHP 8.1, and someone has the great idea to run apt-update. Suddenly you're running 8.2. So what do you recommend? Apt, mark, hold, stuff like that, or what's...
Well, okay. Again, it's a bit of a complex question to answer. In general, I'm a big fan of which I think Martin Fowler called immutable servers. So you're not actually changing the server itself once it's being set up. That of course requires you to either have containers or virtual machines, because otherwise you simply can't do this. If you would do update or DNF update or YAM update or whatever, and it would change the major version of PHP, I would change distribution, because this is a serious backwards compatibility break that should not happen. So it would be a deliberate change that you would have to trigger. So by either deliberately switching to a different repository, which by default returns you with a different version of PHP. But then that's your decision to actually do that. What you could do in the Red Hat world, and I have to admit I don't know how the Debian world would deal with that, is you can specify an explicit directory tree where you want to install it into. So even if the package says, hey, I want to have my files stored in user bin whatever, you can say, no, please put this in whatever directory tree that I wanted, and then have all the dependencies resolved there. So you can technically install it on that particular machine, but it's actually a new chroot environment kind of thing that you would create from there. So you can install it in parallel anyway, and then test and switch around. So the biggest issue would be here having a system that you actually have to maintain and where everything is running on, like the traditional, like back 20 years ago, you had like one box where everything was running on. This is probably really hard to maintain. So moving away from this kind of setup and just having alternative systems would probably be helpful. This gets particularly true if you want to upgrade from a really old version of PHP that was compiled for that particular distribution to a recent version, because all the other dependencies are probably outdated as well. It's not like PHP itself, but like all the libraries that you're using, even the C library at the very low level is going to be seriously old, because that system cannot be up to date. So there might be all kinds of issues with that. But again, it depends on that particular scenario. Does that answer your question somewhat? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have one more? Or sorry, no time.
Okay,
Anyone
so
has questions again? Also
yes, you can find us. We are going to be running around here. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.